Nintendo released the Game Boy in 1989, and it was a marvel of engineering. It could last close to 30 hours on 4 AA batteries, and was extremely durable. At the Nintendo Museum in New York City, they actually have a Game Boy on display that was blown up during the Gulf War, and it still turns on. Including the Game Boy Color, over 118 million handhelds were sold. Now, even though the Game Boy sold incredibly well, I can tell you that most of its games weren't very good. There were over 1,000 Game Boy titles, and almost as many for the Game Boy Color, but a lot of them were cheaply made tie-ins based on cartoons or movies. Studios were pumping out as many games for the device as possible. Despite the flood of mediocre releases, there were still a handful of must-play classics, and perhaps the greatest of them all was The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. Next to Super Mario, the Legend of Zelda series is arguably the most critically acclaimed franchise in gaming history. It's one of those series people will buy without even reading reviews, because you just know the games will be amazing, or at the very least worth your time. That's generally been true with the exception of a couple infamous CDI games we don't really like to talk about. Despite growing up with the franchise, I never played a single Zelda game until A Link Between Worlds on the 3DS. I guess I was always a bit intimidated, but after finishing A Link Between Worlds, I wanted more, and just like Link, I set out on a quest of my own to play every single Zelda game. I started with the original Legend of Zelda on the NES, which is brutally hard by today's standards, but with the use of a guide, you can beat it relatively quick. Zelda 2, on the other hand, may have actually been one of, if not the hardest games I have ever played in my life. When I got to Link to the Past, I was so relieved, but I'll add that I also found this third game to be a little difficult as well, and there were several boss fights that really frustrated me. Finally, on a rainy Saturday morning, I decided to tackle Link's Awakening, and of all the early Zelda games, this one turned out to be my favorite by far. Before I get too far into the review, I want to point out that in some of the footage, you'll see me playing Link's Awakening in color. That's because I chose the DX version for this video. I just feel like colorized graphics simply look better than the monochrome original. And yes, I'm aware the game was remade on the Switch. I'll definitely get around to talking about that later. But first, I want to discuss how the original game came to be. Believe it or not, Link's Awakening actually started off as a side project by a group of Nintendo programmers who got their hands on an early Game Boy development kit. These programmers would hang out after work and experiment with it as sort of an after-school club. Because it began as a fun side project, the developers had the freedom to do pretty much whatever they wanted, and they got really creative. Around that time, A Link to the Past had just been released on the Super Nintendo and was being hailed as one of the greatest video games ever made. Takashi Tezuka, who directed A Link to the Past, requested permission to make a Zelda game for the Game Boy. He originally planned to port A Link to the Past, but after seeing what the After School Club had created, he decided it would be better to make an entirely new game instead. Since Link's Awakening began as a passion project, it was developed by people who saw it as a labor of love rather than just another job, and it really shows. The developers even included cameos from other Nintendo characters, sometimes without even asking permission.
Oh my gosh, it's the dude from Super Mario Bros. 2, right? That's the bad guy from Super Mario Bros. 2.
The plot of Link's Awakening was surprisingly controversial. In previous games, the goal was always to save Zelda and Hyrule. This time, Zelda doesn't even appear, and the adventure takes place on a mysterious island instead. It was meant to be viewed as kind of a spin-off, and the idea of a giant egg on top of a mountain was actually inspired by a dream. Yoshiaki Koizumi was in charge of writing the story. Despite having very little experience in video games, he originally wanted to work in the film industry. The villagers that Link meets in the game were inspired by the TV show Twin Peaks, which was hugely popular at the time. If you've never watched Twin Peaks, I highly encourage you to check it out. The first season is only 8 episodes, and it has a tone unlike anything else I've ever seen. Both Koizumi and Tezuka were big fans of the show. Twin Peaks follows an FBI agent named Dale Cooper, played by Kyle MacLachlan, who investigates a murder in the strange town of Twin Peaks. Everyone in town seems to have a secret, or at least behaves in an odd way. The most famous scene in Twin Peaks occurs in the third episode when Agent Cooper has a dream in which he meets a bizarre collection of characters waiting in a room. When creating Link's Awakening, the developers had to come up with a way to explain why the game was so different from previous Zelda titles. So they decided to make the entire game take place inside of a dream. But the plot is way more complex than it first appears. After a shipwreck, Link is rescued by a girl named Marin. He is told by a talking owl that the only way to leave the island is to wake the Windfish, who sleeps inside a giant egg. Waking the Windfish isn't simple. Link must collect the 8 instruments of the sirens hidden in dungeons across the island. The gameplay is similar to A Link to the Past, but slightly simplified to account for the Game Boy's limited controls. Otherwise, the experience feels similar. Link travels to various locations, clears dungeons, unlocks new items, and gains access to more of the map. There are hidden heart pieces to boost his health, as well as several fun mini-games. I actually prefer Link's Awakening to A Link to the Past mainly because I found it easier and less frustrating. A Link to the Past is definitely a masterpiece, but some of the boss fights were tough and enemies seemed to respawn constantly while dropping fewer hearts. If A Link to the Past is considered the greatest game on the Super Nintendo, then a strong argument could be made that Link's Awakening is the greatest game on the Game Boy. In fact, I call it the first true masterpiece on a handheld console. Before the Game Boy, portable gaming was fairly basic, but when Nintendo released Metroid 2: Return of Samus, it proved that the Game Boy could deliver games just as good, if not better, than those on the NES. Link's Awakening showed just how far the Game Boy's limits could be pushed. In A Link to the Past, the key to the boss room was called the Big Key, but in Link's Awakening, it's known as the Nightmare Key. The reason is clever. The enemies Link fights are actually the nightmares of the Windfish. You see, this isn't Link's dream. He's inside of the Windfish's dream. Everything on the island exists only within that dream. Over time, it's revealed that none of the island's inhabitants have ever left or even know what lies beyond the ocean. All of the Zelda games up to that point had relatively simple stories, often explained mostly in the manual, but Link's Awakening was surprisingly deep. At one point, Link learns that if he wakes the Windfish, the island and everyone on it, including Marin, the woman who rescued him and grew close to him, will cease to exist.
So this is what's telling us, hey, this is literally all a dream. So every single thing that's happening here is a dream, and it's all going to vanish if we wake up.
One of my favorite parts of Link's Awakening is the side-scrolling sections. There are a few areas where Link ends up in sort of underground tunnels facing off against enemies from the Super Mario universe, like the Goombas and Piranha Plants. There's even a chain chomp in the game that a woman in the village keeps as a pet. Link ends up rescuing it and takes it for a walk. There's also a long trading sequence that begins when you win a Yoshi stuffed animal from a crane machine. You then trade that Yoshi for a ribbon, then trade the ribbon for dog food, and so on. The trading quest concept would later appear in many other Zelda games as well as in other Nintendo franchises such as Paper Mario. The cutscenes that go along with the trading game are often hilarious. My favorite one is when you give a man a letter that his girlfriend wrote to him, and the letter has a picture of Princess Peach.
Whoa! That's Christine? That is not Christine. That is not Christine. This dude's being catfished.
It takes a lot of work to actually complete all the trades in the game, but if you do, then you will eventually unlock the boomerang, one of the most powerful weapons. It can defeat the final form of the last boss in just one hit.
There we go. Yeah, if you hit him in the eye with the boomerang, it's like an instant kill.
Link's Awakening was also the first Zelda game to include a fishing minigame, a feature that has appeared in many subsequent entries. There are also seashells all over the island, and if you collect 20 of them, you can unlock the level 2 sword, which can deal twice as much damage. You can actually get this halfway through the game. I love how in this game you feel a lot stronger as you progress. In older games, every time Link gets an upgrade, you barely notice it because the game was constantly getting harder. This was especially noticeable in Zelda 2: Link's Adventure. In that game, every time I would get a health upgrade, you barely noticed it because in each dungeon the enemies seemed to hit twice as hard. In this game, the difficulty does still increase as you go through, but without any major spikes. Most of the time, the only things that get noticeably harder is the puzzles in the dungeons themselves. These optional side quests make the game even more enjoyable, and they're another reason why I prefer it to A Link to the Past. During the development of A Link to the Past, director Tezuka wanted to give Link the ability to unequip his sword, allowing him to use 2 support items at the same time. However, Miyamoto, the game's producer, thought it would be a bad idea. By the time Link's Awakening was in development, Miyamoto was busy with other projects, so Tezuka had much more creative freedom. He finally got a chance to implement his idea. In this game, Link can unequip the sword and equip 2 other items, such as the Pegasus boots and the Roc's feather, which allow him to make running jumps. This change made boss fights more interesting, as some now require you to use 2 different items to succeed. Although this was a great innovation, the Game Boy only had 2 assignable buttons, so I often had to go back into my inventory to switch items. This is probably my biggest complaint about the game, and trust me when I say this is extremely annoying. In some of the dungeons at the end of the game, I had to switch items about 50 times, and having to hit select and manually change each item one at a time 50 times got old really quick. But this annoyance is more a limitation of the hardware than the developer's imagination. Some of the boss fights and enemies are also recycled from Link to the Past, but I didn't really care about that because I think that they are much more balanced in this game. Some of the boss fights in Link to the Past were unnecessarily hard and pushed you to the absolute limit, but the fights in Link's Awakening all seemed completely fair and doable. Heart containers are also in the overworld just like in Link to the Past, but there are less of them. Collecting all the heart containers in Link's Awakening only gets you about 3 extra hearts, but in Link to the Past you could get 6 extra hearts. Link's Awakening makes up for this by having other things to collect, such as that trading sequence game I mentioned earlier and the seashells. When Nintendo released Link's Awakening, it received rave reviews. To help promote the game in the US, Nintendo even held a contest where gamers were invited on a train ride. They were given early copies of the game, and the first person to beat it would win $1,000. When the Game Boy Color released, Link's Awakening was reimagined in color. That's the version I played for this review. The biggest difference was the inclusion of an extra dungeon simply called the Color Dungeon. It's one of the easiest dungeons in the game, and as a reward for completing it, players can choose between the blue or red tunic. The blue tunic reduces damage Link takes, while the red tunic increases the damage he deals. The DX version also added support for the Game Boy printer, one of the strangest but surprisingly fun accessories that Nintendo ever developed. There is a photographer that will show up throughout the game and take your picture at critical moments. You can then print these photos off. This was a time before screenshots were possible, so the Game Boy printer allowed people to capture moments from games to show off to their friends. In 2019, Link's Awakening received another remake for the Nintendo Switch. The 2D sprite graphics were replaced with clay-like animation, and it looked amazing. I remember it released the same day as the Switch Lite. I actually played the remake when it came out, so yes, I played the remake before I played the original. There are a lot of people who are against remakes and claim that it shows game developers lack imagination, but I'm so glad it was released, not just so I could experience it, but so a new generation could enjoy the game with modern quality of life improvements. Let's face it, gaming has come a long way, and some younger players struggle with older titles because the controls or layouts aren't as intuitive as today's games. I feel that both the original Link's Awakening and the DX version still hold up very well, so a remake wasn't desperately needed. If any game could benefit from a modern overhaul, it might be Zelda 2 or even the original. Regardless, the Switch remake was a blast, and at the time of its release, it was probably one of the top 5 games on the system. If you have any fond memories of playing Link's Awakening, let me know in the comments, or just tell me what your favorite Zelda game is. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing.
The Windfish. What we've been trying to wake up this entire game. Here we go. You woke him from his slumber. So now the world as we know it is going to completely disappear.